importantly, in terms of what's happening here, is that the ash cloud, as a result of Tambora, created enormous crop failures. So folks were starving. At that time, clans were living a bit like the clans of Scotland of old, but there had been developing a military genius on the eastern side of South Africa by the name of Rorke, which is our name I'm sure most of you have heard. It was a name that became indeed a quiver on the lips of anybody who was not a Zulu. And Rorke became paramount chief of the Zulus in 1816. And with him becoming paramount chief of the Zulus, he began to forge them into a mighty military nation. And we have a period in this country called the evokes, the crushing, if you translate that directly, where clans fell upon one another. The men were killed, women were kept as servants and for breeding purposes, and the children were kept as servants and future warriors. Many tribes resorted to cannibalism to survive. Many were pushed into very marginal areas of South Africa in order to survive. And everyone will tell you that at the epicenter of the evokes stood Rorke. I believe it had more to do with the climate change and the associated deprivations on account of Tambora than ever had to do with Rorke, but that is my view on this matter. What is interesting about Rorke is that he changed the Zulu fighting tactics. He created what is called impondo komesho, the horns of the bull or the horns of the buffalo, where younger bodies of fighting men, the horns would run around the enemy to encircle it. Then the head and chest would come in to finish the enemy off. And to that end, he said, we're no longer going to throw our assegais at the enemy, we're going to keep them in hand. And they were smelted down into a short-shafted, broad-bladed stabbing assegai that the Zulus call umkhanta. But at the time of the Anglo-Zulu War, they called these weapons the sound it makes as it goes into and is pulled from the human body. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with South African history, you need to understand that we have, in 1838, perhaps the most pivotal battle in South African history, being the Battle of Blood River, that took place on the 16th of December, 1838, between Boers, led by Andries Pretorius, and the Zulu army. The Zulu army at that time were under the command of a new king called Dingaan. He, along with his brother Mhlangane, had murdered Rorke in the year 1828, and Dingaan ascended the throne. In the interim, the British politicians promulgated legislation in this country for the emancipation of slaves. And a lot of the Dutch East India officials, Dutchmen, French, and others who were living in the Cape, who had fled Europe on account of religious persecution, the Edict of Nantes and its subsequent revocation in 1685, had settled in the Cape, the southwestern part of South Africa, with abundant slaves. And when the promulgation of this legislation took place regarding the release of slaves, they were told they would be paid for their slaves, but had to collect the compensation in person in London. Well, this immediately antagonized Boers and others, and they took off inland in what became known as the Great Trek, the Groot Trek, the Great Movement Inland. Fascinating part of South African history that has been very poorly taught in our schools, but an epic of human struggle and endeavor, where 12 to 15,000 people moved inland into the hinterland of South Africa. And as a result of that movement, Boers interacted with the new Zulu king, King Dingaan. Dingaan was distrusting of the Boers, and in a great act of duplicity and subterfuge, Dingaan and his warriors murdered Piet Retief and 70 of his retainers. Andries Pretorius then led the Boer army against the Zulu army that resulted in a battle on the banks of the Ngome River on the 16th of December of 1838. Well, eventually the Boers got onto the reed beds above the river and fired down into the river at Zulus trying to cross till the water of the river ran red with blood. Hence the name of that pivotal, famous battle, the Battle of Blood River. And if you're interested in this country's political history, which I hope by virtue of you being present on this Zoom session you are, Most folks assume that our policy of apartheid and separate development began in 1948 with Hendrik Verwoerd and the Nationalist Party coming to power. In my view, that 110 years late, it began with these doughty Calvinistic Boers defeating the Zulus at Blood River without losing a single life. And from that point forward, the idea of being the chosen people in the promised land and having divine intervention on their side would largely be the precursor to their treatment of colored people in this country from 1838 onwards. Now, King Dingaan of the Zulus was murdered by his own people, helped by the Swazis in 1840, and his son, a man called Mpande, became king of the mighty warrior nation, the Zulus. He was not aggressive or militarily orientated like Rorke and Dingaan had been. Far more diplomatic, far more politically astute. He wanted to see the province of Natal succeed and prosper during his reign. And it did. Sugarcane plantations began to plant sugarcane along the coastal plain. Indentured Indian laborers were brought out from India to work in the sugarcane plantations. With them came a lawyer to defend their rights, Mohandas Gandhi, who became the great Mahatma. But in 1856, King Mpande was considered to be becoming too old and infirm to continue leading the Zulu nation. And he was implored upon by his high council to nominate from amongst his sons his heir. Well, he did what any peace-loving father would do, I think, in similar circumstance. He gave two sons a war shield, one being Mboyazi, the other an older boy called Quechua, who were descended from different mothers. Zulus practice polygamy. The succession rate is very difficult because they don't rely on primogeniture as we do. There's a first wife, a great wife, and other wives. As a result, many offspring from various wives, and as a result, succession to the throne is a tricky question. Well, this plunged Zululand into a civil war as both brothers collected about themselves their respective factions. Mboyazi collected about himself the Mandlakazi, and Quechua collected about himself the Usutu. And these two great factions fell upon one another on the banks of the mighty flooded Tugela River on the 2nd of December 1856 at a place called Ndonda Kuzuka. Incredible battle. Most people never heard of it. More people lost in that battle that have been lost on African soil since the Crusades. 30,000 lives lost. 25,000 on the side of the Mandlakazi, 5,000 on the side of the Usutu. As a result of that, and being victorious, Quechua was the obvious heir to the throne, but he had to wait for his father to die of natural causes. I make this point because most Zulu kings did not die of natural causes. They were helped on their way either by poison or a sharpened implement. In the interim, we have a situation where in 1867, diamonds were discovered at a place called Hopetown, would later become Kimberley, the greatest pipe of kimberlite diamonds the world will ever know. The British found it mildly inconvenient that the diamonds were found in the territory of the Orange Free State. So they held a hasty commission called the Keat Commission, moved the Board of the Cape to include the diamond fields, and gave the Free State an insatiable demand for everything they could produce upon their border, but freed them the issues of a mining town within their territory. This caused considerable antagonism amongst the Afrikaans farmers and Boers in the Free State, as you can imagine. Only a few years later, in 1873, gold was discovered on the Mpumalanga escarpments, Burke's Luck, Pilgrim's Rest, near the present Kruger National Park. With this, a huge number of people came into South Africa wanting to try their luck and their fortunes, either on the diamond fields or on the gold fields. And the Boers, who were a small population, began to feel incredibly threatened by this influx of what they called Uitlanders, outlanders or foreigners from abroad. In the interim, what is particularly interesting in terms of our story is that the British confederated Canada in 1867, the same year as diamonds were discovered in this country. And Lord Carnarvon, who was a great confederationist, proposed a plan of confederation for South Africa, as Britain had achieved with Canada in 1867. In the interim, King Mpande, you recall, died of natural causes in 1872. He was a man of immense physical proportions, probably weighed 550 pounds at the time of his death. And with it, his son, the Victor and Ndonda Kozuka, King Cetshwayo, took over as king of the Zulus. And he wanted to restore the Zulus to their earlier nationalism and pride and stature amongst Southern African nations. And the British, who were beginning to show a strong proactive interest in South Africa, great climate, good farming lands, abundant cheap labor, sea route around the Cape, then the discovery of diamonds and gold. They felt that South Africa would be a glittering addition to the crown of the empire, and proposed a plan of confederation to achieve that, as they'd done with Canada in 1867. But the land of milk and honey had bees. The bees were the Zulus, and the Zulus had a new king, King Cetshwayo, who ascended the throne aggressively in 1872 upon the passing of his father, Mpande. And the British felt that this resurrected, burgeoning Zulu army, being re-nationalized by King Cetshwayo, stood as a major military threat to the British plan of confederation. And that, in a nutshell, is why the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 took place. It was not about land. It was about regional military supremacy. The British felt the Zulu army needed to be subdued and disbanded if the confederation would ever be stable and secure. So let's go to our first slide, please, James. It's interesting to note that if you look at this photograph, this is a photo of the mountain of Isandlwana, which I think you will agree looks uncannily above that white rectangle like the Sphinx. Isn't it interesting to note that British soldiers of the 24th Regiment had fought against Napoleon along the Nile in 1801 successfully. And after that campaign, they adopted the Sphinx as a regimental badge. And it was worn on helmet plates, cap badges, and collar badges. And many of the men who filled the ranks were superstitious, illiterate little fellows who did not like the look of this mountain and the fact that it so closely resembled the Sphinx. What is fascinating for me is that when these soldiers who died on this battlefield, when they climbed off ships in Cape Town in January of 1875, 4 years earlier, one of the first landmarks they would have seen was Lion's Head, looking just like the Sphinx. And I wonder if it gave them a premonition then that things might go wrong, that there was a presentiment of coming evil about being in this country. 4 years later, having marched 3,000 miles across our country, their commander, Lord Chelmsford, decides that this setting at Isandlwana constituted a suitable campsite for the central British column, comprising 4,850 men, 4,500 oxen, 220 wagons and carts, 850 tents housed those 4,850 men. On this map, represented roughly by the white rectangle. The black rectangle to the top left of the white marks the wagon park, where wagons were loosely parked between Isandlwana and a rocky hill off to the left of our picture to the south of the mountain. Lord Chelmsford then got word that the Zulus were massing in numbers off to the southeast of the camp, and in a very strange move, he split the force and moved out to the front 10 miles away with 2,700 men and 4 cannons, leaving 1,800 men and 2 cannons to look after this camp where he believed there was no threat. Well, on Wednesday, the 22nd of January, 1879, word began to arrive that Zulus had been found in large numbers off to the north of the camp, to the right of our photograph as we see it. Well, the thin red line was established. A British firing line was established where that red line runs across the front of the camp. And for those of you who are wondering why it is so far out, that shaded purple bluish area on the bottom half of the photograph marks what we call dead ground. those villages and ground you cannot see from the camp. And this is why the British had to move their firing line out onto the forward crest of that ridge, that they could fire down into that dead ground beyond. And when we take folks to Isandlwana, they are staggered by the complexities and the convolutions of the ground, the size of the battlefield, that dead ground that is crucial to your overall understanding of what happened on this field. Well, the Zulu army were discovered by a mounted British patrol and decided in that moment to change stride mid-step and attack the British camp. And 25,000 Zulu warriors began to spread out on the horns of the bull, running towards this camp. Behind them, 15,000 teenage boys and women who would scream and ululate at the height of the battle to spur the men on in action. Well, isn't it wonderful to consider that there was a groom in the camp that day, a man called John Williams. He was one of only 55 white men who got off the field alive, who said in a letter to his mother, he said, "Mother, I thought everything in the camp was under control. But then something prevailed upon me to turn and look up at the hills to the north, and my blood turned cold. I beheld a spectacle that was more appalling than any I wish any soldier to ever behold. The hills to the north of the camp turned black with Zulus, as rank upon rank of Zulu warrior stepped out onto that escarpment. And as one, they began to pull their shields off to the left to give the illusion of the numbers having doubled. Then they would thump the assegai shafts into their shields in this rhythmic thumping sound, rather like a large, heavy train approaching. And how many of you know that the commander of the Zulus on this day was 70 years of age, and that he had jog-trotted 70 miles to lead his army against the British in this most auspicious of moments? His name was Inchingwayo Kamachola Koza. Most history books don't even mention his name. It's an indictment on us all. And when he could see that his men were ready to go, he lifted his battle axe in his right hand and he bellowed, "I sham, ein gan, haba," to arms go in. And 25,000 Zulus began to close on that camp. Because of the color of the shield, you could recognize the regiments at a mile. And I can tell you that from the left, we have the Utulwan, the Inhlanhla, the Ihloko, and the Indlo Yangwe regiment. Then we have the Ututu, the Isang, the Notwengu, the Undi, the Unonkang, the Umbob, the Mhlab, the Kanempamb, the Mkij, the Nhlab, the Nkab, and then down to the right front of the camp, in front of Durnford's Donga, were the mighty Ngobama Corps and the Ube regiments. And do you know that as they came on like a great black wave, the British rifle fire and cannon fire on that thin red line opened fire, and there's a moment in the battle where it hung in the balance, where the thin red line was holding and the Zulu attack had been checked in its tracks. The Zulus were about to withdraw. You will notice on the bottom right of the photograph, there's a little green cross. That marks the position where Zulu commander called Nkosana Kampundlana of the Biela clan, noticing that his men were about to turn and withdraw, got up and strode confidently to the front, turning his back on the British firing line. And he bellowed, "Yenina lapia, ninga baleg, silo, uhlahlana bulala umlilo, ungashonga njalo." You men, don't run, don't run. The small branch that extinguishes the flames, that's one of King Ketwa's praise names. He gave us no such order. Do you know that he'd hardly uttered that cry when half of his head was carried?
Sorry, you said another 10 minutes. The car came on, it's all right.
Shall I put the pork in there?
Not jet's be too early for that.
It's not going to take long. The pork.
No.
Potatoes.
Isn't it wonderful to consider that with this man rallying the Zulu attack,
Yeah. All right, I'll put the gravy ready.
Vegetables.
See.
it would be very helpful if folks muted their microphones, please. Now, with this man rekindling, restoring the Zulu attack, it is remarkable to consider that the Zulus would rise up like a great black wave and fall on that thin red British firing line. And they began to push those British soldiers back into the camp. The tents had not been struck, where the slaughter began in earnest, and they pushed them back into the wagon park, marked by that black rectangle, where British soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, back to back, and fought to the bitter end. The Zulus tell us later they fought like lions and they fell like stones, that the Zulus had never previously met such a brave adversary than the red-coated soldier at Isandlwana. Colonel Durnford was amongst the last to fall, surrounded by his beloved black soldiers who would have followed him anywhere. Now, when we go to Isandlwana, our tour lasts roughly 6 hours. We do a lot of background about South African history and Zulu history leading up to the outbreak of this unfortunate war. I'll take you up onto the heights above Isandlwana and give you an overview of the whole battlefield. Battlefield of this side is on the Somme, had more than 1 million men deployed, 1916. Then we'll come down onto the battlefield and sit you down in chairs and begin to explain what happened on this field, which is considered today one of the greatest Victorian defeats at the hand of the native army in the entire Victorian era. And isn't it wonderful to consider that on the spot where Colonel Durnford fell, there is a memorial. And although that memorial contains the words "for England's sake," I believe it should pertain to all at Isandlwana, white and black, colonial and imperial, Zulu and Basotho. And if I can remember the words of that inscription in a story that saw nearly 4,500 good men die, and in the height of the battle, the sun went dark in a 70% eclipse. You can't make this stuff up. Those words read thus: "Not theirs to save the day, but where they stood falling to dye the earth with brave men's blood. For England's sake and duty be their names sacred among us. Neither praise nor blame add to the epitaph. Rather let it be simple as that which marks Thermopylae. Go tell it in England, thee that pass us by, that here, faithful to their charge, her soldiers lie." Well, isn't it extraordinary to consider that Lord Chelmsford returned to this camp at around 7 o'clock that dreadful evening? It was pitch dark, no moon, hence the eclipse in the early afternoon. And Lord Chelmsford was pacing up and down in the old wagon park where the black rectangle stands, and he looked off to the west, and in the distance beyond Isandlwana you can see another isosceles triangle-shaped hill 10 miles off to the west. That's the mountain of Shian, the Oscarberg mountain behind Rorke's Drift. And as that mountain began to become silhouetted by fire, Chelmsford realized, my God, the Zulus have crossed the river. They've crossed the border into Natal and they're attacking Rorke's Drift. We only have 400 soldiers there, 300 black, 100 white. They don't stand a hope. The Battle of Isandlwana was over. The Battle of Rorke's Drift had already begun on the same afternoon. And the day's toll for the British was not yet over. Let's go to the next slide, please, James. Now, Rorke's Drift has a very interesting history. These are the buildings as they stand today. The building on the left with the red tin roof is now a church. On the night of the fight, it stood as the store or storehouse. The building to the right, contained within those white lines, is the old hospital building, now a museum. And those white lines mark where British soldiers in desperation, when they heard that the Zulus had overwhelmed Isandlwana and their veteran soldiers, their heroes, and were on their way to attack Rorke's Drift, they built barricades using 200-pound Hessian bags of mealie meal. Part of the British staple diet at that time was stiff white maize meal porridge. I find it humbling that British soldiers and Zulu warriors were eating largely the same staple, stiff white maize meal porridge. And here at Rorke's Drift, there was a veritable heap of mealie bags to keep the 5,000-strong central column fed and on the move. And with those bags, the British soldiers ran a 4-foot-high line bag of mealie bags from the front corner of the store to the rear corner of the hospital, marked by that upper white line. It's about 40 yards. They built a similar line of mealie bags all the way across the front, marked by that lower white line on top of a 5-foot-high sandstone ridge, which is somewhat obscured by the shadows of those trees. But on the night of the fight, there was a 5-foot-high sandstone ridge, coupled now with a 4-foot-high line of mealie bags. This battlefield is about 3 or 4 tennis courts in extent. It is the absolute mirror of Isandlwana, where Isandlwana is enormous, Rorke's Drift is tiny, which is largely why it worked. And that thin red line across the center of those white lines marks a line of biscuit boxes, which were erected at the last minute from the front corner of the store across to the mealie bags in the front to divide that courtyard or lawn area into 2/3 near the hospital and 1/3 in front of the store. What is interesting about that hospital building to the right and the store, on the night of the battle, they had thatched roofs, which you recall from the movie Zulu, which launched Michael Caine's career, were set on fire. But those rooms in the hospital building were of a very strange nature. Down the southern side of the building, on the extreme right, and down the rear side of the building, were a series of little cubbyhole type rooms that opened only to the outside. They had a doorway to the outside to allow people access to the bathroom.
I've just looked online. You put when you calling during Jordan.
And those wards or little rooms had been converted by the British into makeshift wards where pallets were arranged on poles off the wall to make a bunk bed and a straw mattress, and men were plugged in there dying of uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting. And when the Zulus attacked Rorke, they set the thatch roof alight on the right front corner of the hospital building. And that gave the men inside two terrible choices: to stay in the room and die in the fire, or come out of the door and be killed in a Zulu spear. So they literally began to dig for their lives. They began to dig holes through the walls, room by room by room, trying to get from one end of the hospital building to the other to escape the fire, the Zulus, the darkness, and death itself. It is the most incredible story. I've not mentioned to you yet that the average age of a British soldier at Rorke was 23. They were all recruits. They were green. Compare them with those veterans, average age 32 at Isandlwana, who were slaughtered practically to a man by the Zulus. And one of them, a young man called John Williams Fielding, he's always referred to as John Williams, 1395. He led the dig that night through 4 walls in the hospital, digging with his bare hands, a broken pickaxe and 2 bayonets, damaging his hands so badly that they never recovered. And although he earned a Victoria Cross for his efforts, when he was buried aged 74 in Llantarnam in Wales in 1932, they buried a man whose hands had never recovered from the horrors of digging through the walls in the hospital at Rorke. Let's go to the next picture, please, James. Please understand that in this next map, we are looking at the hospital and the store from the other perspective. The hospital is now on the left, and the store is on the right with a cattle enclosure in front of it, and you can see the lines marking the barricades. Well, I want to tell you the story about a remarkable man in that hospital building called Alfred Henry Hook, the cook. 28 years of age. He was a powerfully built man, and he said, I was taken down the back of the hospital, and I was put into one of those tiny little cubbyhole type rooms, and the door frame was burst off the wall and nailed in across the doorway, and the doorway was barricaded to its top with 200-pound bags of mealie meal. Hook said we were pinned like rats in a hole. Hook said, try and imagine the noise. It was indescribable. The shouting of Zulu war songs, the screaming of patients who knew they were going to die, the roofs on fire, the report of the Martini Henrys bursting eardrums. And Hook said 6 times that night on the back of the hospital, the Zulus got hold of my rifle and they tried to pull that rifle from my hand. But Hook said I had a better grip than they did, and I'd pull it back, shoot a Zulu and stab the next. A Zulu was able to lunge through his loophole and stab Hook on the top of the head, a wound that plagued him for the rest of his life. Well, largely led by Hook, they were able to drag 27 of the initial 35 sick men in that hospital from the left or southern side of the hospital building, the southern side, all the way through to the northern side facing the commissariat store. And the wall facing the store had a 4-foot square hole in it, 8 foot off the ground, access to the ground by a wooden step ladder. And Hook scrambled up that wooden step ladder. He said the building was now collapsing on account of the fire, and the men left us inside had been pushed up beneath me against the wall, about to die in the fire. And Hook said, I looked out, and complete was my shock and my horror. You see, he did not know that the British had earlier built a line of biscuit boxes, and that the British soldiers from around the hospital had much earlier on been pushed back to behind the biscuit boxes in front of the store. And he said, I looked out and I could see Zulus behind the barricade and ledge, and Zulus behind this barricade and wagon. And I could see the tea-stained helmets of my comrades 40 paces away behind a line of biscuit boxes in front of the store. Do you know who asked for volunteers? And two men, Frederick Hitch and William Wilson Allen, immediately volunteer to start running the 40 yards, a gauntlet of hell, across to the hospital wall. Hitch has already been shot through the shoulder, but he, despite his injury, is helping men out of the loft onto the ground, providing a step. Allen, with his injured arm, helping men down, Hook with his injured head, passing them out of the loft. Do you know that Hook said in his remarkable account, Robert Jones and William Jones, and John Williams, who finished the flight with no flesh or skin on his hands, and oh yes, myself, he said, Private Henry Hook the cook, he said, we were the last to leave the hospital. And we leapt down from the loft and we grabbed our rifles and we raced across the courtyard to join our comrades behind the biscuit boxes. Hook said, I guess it was about 9:30 that night. Have no illusions of the fight in the hospital taking 20 or 25 minutes to effect. That fight took more like 4 hours, during which time they dug through 4 walls and are pulling their comrades through the walls, the fire, the Zulus, the darkness, and death itself. Do you know that Hook returned to England, having received a Victoria Cross on the 12th of August of 1879 from Sir Garnet Wolseley at Mahlabatini down near Ishawi? Wolseley never even got off his horse. He bent down from the saddle to affix the VC to Hook's chest, believing that far too many VCs were being awarded to the men who defended Rorke's Drift. He was illiterate. He returned to England to find that his wife had assumed him dead. She sold all their possessions, including their home, and had taken up with someone else. When the government intervened on Hook's behalf, he couldn't find a job. He became janitor in the British Museum, developed a huge lump on the top of his head from the assegai thrust, but died of another malady, one that took many of these brave men's lives, tuberculosis. He died on the 12th of March, 1905, aged 53. His comrades had never forgotten him for his actions at Rorke's Drift, took him back to Churcham in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire for burial. His grave was a simple affair. He wouldn't have wanted it any other way. But at its base was a little inscription, I think, put there because of the way he was treated after the war. And those lovely words read, if one's time has come to die, one should die manfully for one's brethren's sake, without cause for reproach against one's glory. Special words, for my opinion, a quite extraordinary human being. Now, we always like to time our tours for Rorke's Drift in the mid to late afternoon, which is around the time the battle began. And I want to tell you to stand on that battlefield that is only 4 or 5 tennis courts in extent, and to move around the hospital building on the left and describe the fight room by room as it happened, and then move across the courtyard to the biscuit boxes as the British stood on the night, and stand with them in front of the store and imagine the horrors for them, and then stand where that little oval marks the final redoubt built out of mealie bags, conical in shape, 12 feet high, hollowed out on the top, placed in there for 12 men. And John Chard said, not if, he said, when there are 12 of us left, you take up your positions in this redoubt and fight from here your final stand as British soldiers do. Never say die nor surrender. Well, do you know this battle saw the 300 men of the Natal native contingent flee early on before the Zulus even arrived. It left 139 British soldiers, 35 of whom were sick as hospital patients, to defend the post against 4,000 Zulus, in a battle that ran for nearly 10 hours with systematic attacks by waves of Zulus. The British were able to just hold them out. As Frank Bourne would later say, the colour sergeant, put the British soldier behind a barricade in close contact with his comrade and his ammunition. Don't dare betray him with poor leadership. Then he's a tough nut to crack, isn't he? If all you have to tackle him with is your practically naked body, you're all Zulu courage and a stick. But as Frank Bourne always added, with a good deal of British guts thrown in. And do you know that what happened on this tiny little battlefield, 4 or 5 tennis courts in extent, let's go back to the previous picture, James, became the ethos, the essence, the foundation of Welsh and British fighting spirit thereafter. The 24th Regiment have been amalgamated with others to form what is now known as the Royal Welsh. They have one of the most illustrious rolls of honor in the British Army, having fought at Gallipoli on the Somme in 1916, at Kohima against the Japanese in 1944, and there were many more. And do you know that at all of those battles, the terrified cries of non-commissioned officers, getting even more terrified men up out of the trenches, over the parapets, through the barbed wire, to take on enemy positions, sure to lose their lives, always were the same. And they took their origins on this little piece of ground at sundown, with Colour Sergeant Frank Bourne going from man to man, saying, "Mark your target, my boy. Mark your target as he comes, and hold your fire till you can see the whites of his eyes, and never say die nor surrender." And that cry, of course, would become, "Remember Rorke's Drift, boys. Remember Rorke's Drift," where the British achieved the impossible, and in it would earn 11 Victoria Crosses and 5 Distinguished Conduct Medals. Do you know that this Anglo-Zulu War that was due to be over in 3 weeks would run on for 6 months? It took the British another 5 weeks before they were able to finally capture the king, King Quechua, who was exiled initially to the Cape and then to England, before returning to preside over a kingdom 1/13 the size of his original kingdom as it stood at this time. Remember the Boers on the sidelines. Remember them defeating the Zulus at Blood River. They weren't keen on the British. They'd been given independence of the Free State and the Transvaal by the Sand River Convention of 1854. And when the Zulu army smashed the British at Isandlwana, the Boers thought, well, if we can smash the Zulus at Blood River, and Zulus armed the same way can smash the British at Isandlwana, so can we smash the British. And they promptly did. In the First Transvaal War of Independence, that ran from December of 1880 through to February of 1881, that saw the British suffer defeats at Skeinshoogte and Gogo Heights, and that famous battle of Majuba. The British once again had to give the Boers the unequivocal independence in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. And that, of course, would all change when George Harrison discovered gold on a reef called the Witwatersrand at present-day Johannesburg in 1886. And with it, Uitlanders, foreigners, began to stream back into this country in pursuit of the gold. The Boers realized that if they were given the vote, they could easily, by virtue of their numbers, literally take the Boer republics from them. I'm making it very simplistic. But this would eventually lead to the outbreak of the main Anglo-Boer War in October of 1899. So for those of you kind enough to give me an ear on this platform, we have the Battle of Blood River in 1838, the Battle of Indonda Kozuka in 1856, in terms of Zulu succession for the throne. Victorious was King Quechua, who ascended the throne in 1872. The problem the Zulu army presented the British in terms of their confederation plan by the resurrection of the Zulu army by King Quechua, leading to the main Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. First Transvaal War of Independence, 1880 to 1881, and then the main Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. So this is not an easy, straightforward history to digest. Although South Africa is a young country, it is a fascinating history. And I would be delighted for you to seriously consider joining us on one of James's tours next year, September, to come and explore these battlefields, our glorious country with its beaches, its mountains, the battlefields, the bush, its wonderful restaurants and so forth, and learn more about what makes this country at the tip of Africa tick. I would like now to encourage you, if you have questions or comments you would like to make them with pleasure. Unmute your microphones and let's see what folks may or may not like to contribute or ask, please.
Anybody got some questions for Rob? Chris, I think you wanted to say something about a particular cemetery in South Africa. You'll have to unmute yourself and then talk. Oh.
Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Chris, we can hear you clearly.
Cool. All right. Well, Rob, I'm sure I sort of speak on behalf of everyone when I say super grateful for that. Not only was there lots of detail and lots of facts, but I mean your passion for sort of bringing that to life was really powerful. So thank you. I just wanted to mention. So I have the privilege of being based here in South Africa. I'm a diplomat here. I've been here for 2 years. I've got another 2 to go. And it's more a sort of point of information than anything else. But you referred to the Battle of Majuba Hill, which I went to see the battlefield. And I won't sort of go into that story, conscious of time, but the points of information was that there is a cemetery called Mount Pleasant Cemetery. It's not actually on the hill; it's near the hill, but it contains the graves of the British who lost their lives there. And it's quite, I mean, as military cemeteries often are, it's a very sort of moving place. Most, I would say, of the graves and the monuments there are still in relatively good condition, certainly considering they were put there in the 1880s. But it has fallen into disrepair, largely because it's situated on 2 farmers' fields, and farmers, as you will know, in that part of the world, tend to use fire to burn their crops back. So it sort of inflicted some damage on the cemetery, and a couple of trees have fallen into it. So I and a couple of others are trying to renovate that cemetery and find ways of doing it. You can't even access it very easily at the moment because it's on private land. But the plan really is to open up access to that cemetery a bit more and to raise some funds to its renovation. I don't think it would need a particularly high amount. We are talking to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and a couple of others without much success at the moment. So I don't know whether that cemetery happens to be on your itinerary of tours or not. But if it's not, because it isn't on a lot of the itineraries of other guides I've spoken to, it'd be worth thinking about. It's quite a striking place. But yeah, that was it. Thank you once again.
You're most welcome. Thank you for your kind words. And Majuba remains a very difficult battlefield. Most guides have taken it off their tour and itinerary because very often the guests that we get on the battlefields are not able or capable of walking from the car park to the top of the mountain. There is a lot of issue around private land ownership, trespassing, farm security, and all that. Some of the farmers there, unfortunately, are particularly conservative and right-wing and unpleasantly orientated regarding visitors and the public on their land, walking over their land. And I know that there have been burgeoning problems regarding the cemetery. So most guides that I know have basically abandoned taking guests to the cemetery or to the battlefield itself, up onto the mountain, really because Majuba stands pretty much alone. You really got to go to Majuba with intent. It's not very close to other battlefields unless you go to Ngogo and Skeinshoogte, but even they are quite a drive. And it's a fair distance from Newcastle, Ladysmith, or any other of the traditional jumping off points for the battlefields. So Majuba, you're right, unfortunately, Chris, is experiencing a lot of problems. And the War Graves Commission, I'm not surprised you're not having much success with them. They operate, obviously, a very, very clean bill of health and like to operate with no corruption or lack of transparency. They typically look after battlefields from 1900 onwards. These battles predated by 20 years. They do look after some that predate 1900, but by their own choice and volition. And because of the issues in this country that they've had with corruption, money just disappearing into the hands of corrupt officials, the bodies like Amafa who look after the battlefields will get no support from those Afrikaans farmers. You can rest assured of that. So those farmers would make the job of Amafa, for example, the Monuments Council, as difficult as possible. I hope that they would be far more agreeable and cooperative with you, being a British diplomat, and trying to do it privately. But I can't imagine that Amafa or the Commonwealth War Graves Commission will help you financially, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, we've kind of given up on that idea. I mean, part of the plan is to incorporate it into some economic investment projects which we're running in KwaZulu-Natal anyway, and do that on the basis that it would have economic benefits in terms of tourism. And actually, your point about the farmers, I mean, you know them better than me, but the farmer whose land that cemetery is on is actually, I wouldn't describe him in those terms at all. He was quite friendly. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure there are other questions, but thank you again.
Pleasure.
Adrian, you got a question for Rob?
Yes, thanks, James. Thanks very much, Rob. Really enjoyed the talk, delivered with such enthusiasm. It's very palpable. My question is, given that this engagement was such a setback and an embarrassment at the time for the British, and considering what I would say is perhaps a modest British contingent, why was this called an army that was defeated and not perhaps played down as a reconnaissance in force or something, so that it didn't get the massive negative press that it did at the time?
Well, that's a very interesting point you make, because the British were trying to play down Isandlwana as much as possible, and trying to pump Rorke's drift up as much as possible to take the spotlight off Isandlwana. And I guess it really depends on how one looks at or defines the numbers. But that central column that Lord Chelmsford was commanding was 4,850 strong. And admittedly, less than half of it were left in the camp. But I guess for the government back home, like that of Gladstone, who were very keen to unseat Disraeli and his more conservative government, it was very advantageous for them to say, look at your army who have invaded Zululand without permission or any sort of sanction from Britain, and look what has happened now with this disaster at Isandlwana. So I guess it all depends really on how you define the numbers, whether it's a reconnaissance in strength that came horribly adrift, or whether you consider 4,850 strong column to be worded more strongly than a reconnaissance in strength. But that's an interesting point you make, because certainly the British on the ground here and all of the correspondence going back to Britain, they were trying to downplay Isandlwana and pump Rorke's drift up as positively as possible to take the spotlight away from this disaster.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I hadn't appreciated the home agenda as much as the foreign agenda. My second half of my question actually says Chelmsford was very clear that British camps were to be fully lagered at all times. Yet, really, on his first night out, he didn't lager.
That's a very interesting point. You did right. And when the Board of Inquiry was set up, he tried to pass the blame onto Colonel Glynn, who was the commanding officer of the 24th Regiment of Foot. And when Glynn was brought in front of the commission, he said, I'm very surprised to be asked questions by you gentlemen that the general very well knows the answers to. So the answer as to why they never lagered is intriguing. It was a standing military order that every night in enemy territory you lager your wagons. And Paul Kruger, president of the Transvaal, in a communique with Chelmsford, had said, beware of the Zulus. They're a mighty adversary. They'll use fires and herds of black cattle as decoys, which they did before Isandlwana. And I recommend that you lager your wagons every night in their territory. But the Boer wagons were much smaller and lighter and more maneuverable than those used by the British. The British transport wagons were 22 feet long. They ran on 3-inch wide steel shod wheels. Fully loaded, they weighed around 7,000 pounds. On account of the arrival of the rains, They were being pulled largely no longer by a single span of 16 oxen, but by a double span of 32 oxen. And the logistics and the physical effort involved to disengage your oxen and push these very heavy wagons by manpower alone end to end, with the drawbar, we call the disselboom of one, lying under the wheels of the other into a lager, in a camp where they only planned to be for 2 days before moving forward eastwards towards Ulundi, believing the Zulus would have to be pushed into a corner at their capital Ulundi and forced to fight. Chelmsford allowed the camp to remain unlagered, unentrenched, and unusually spread out. And it's interesting that Tinmouth Melville, who earned one of the first posthumous Victoria Crosses in history by his attempt to save the Queen's colour, when he got back to the camp after the reconnaissance, whilst the camp was being set up by the 2 military secretaries, Prelock and Cleary, Melville said, "We are as vulnerable in this camp as we'd be in an English village. We should have a well-formed wagon lager, or the Zulus may well charge home." How prophetic his words were to be. But it was largely the physical difficulties and the logistical difficulties of moving those heavy wagons into a lager for only 2 days, then disengaging them and hooking up the oxen and moving eastwards again, that prevented them making a lager at Isandlwana.
Thanks very much. As you say, very prophetic warning.
It was a prophetic warning indeed, yes.
Thank you.
Have we got any other questions for Rob?
Yeah, hi Rob. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Sorry, my camera's not working, so you'll just have to listen to my delicate little voice. An excellent talk. Thank you very much indeed. Just a couple of questions. I was lucky enough to be at Isandlwana about 15 years ago, and I either can't remember the answer or can't remember if I actually asked the question. You explained the topography very well. During the battle, what was the vegetation like? Would the British redcoats on the thin red line, would they have had clear view? Obviously, you mentioned about the mass of Zulus coming over the hill, but on the approach,
that's a very interesting question.
And I know the dead ground they wouldn't see, but the small sort of scale English continental European guys against the tall, much taller, I'm assuming, Zulu warriors. Would the vegetation, would that come in anything into it?
The vegetation would not have come into it in any way. Firewood was a major issue. There were no trees. There were very few aloes. It was open grassland, which would not have impeded their view in any way. The war was preceded by 3 years of drought, so even grass and grazing was in short supply. So the vegetation as you see it today is considerably different to the way it was in 1879 by virtue of there being far more invasive trees and aloes now than there were then. And even the grass then would have been short on account of the drought. So there was no impediment in terms of their vision by virtue of the vegetation, absolutely none. Open grassy plains, and as a result, firewood, or the securing of firewood for the British Army, was a major difficulty.
I think whenever we were there, say you're talking 15, 16 years ago, they were investigating another grave at some time down at Rorke's, down the escape route from Isandlwana. Did they ever come across any more remains? Or I know it's obviously been well picked over the years, but at that time they were talking about they found a bit of red serge or something under the ground.
Absolutely. There were a number of remains and very, very nice artifacts found, gold coins, buttons, necklaces, and so forth, found on what's called the Fugitives Trail, which is on the initial descent from the wagon park heading down towards the Manzimnyama River behind Isandlwana, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that they will continue to find these. The dead were spread over a huge area. The ground there is not very rich in loam. It's very shaly and rocky. As a result, bodies don't decompose like they do in loam, and cattle move stones and shallow graves, as do the rains. We get these violent storms here and a lot of runoff and erosion. And as a result, graves are easily confused with Zulu cairns. And then with erosion and a movement of stones by cattle or wildlife, you have remains coming to the surface, and suddenly people saying, wow, these aren't cattle bones or wildlife bones, these are human bones. And then closer investigation reveals that they indeed were casualties from Isandlwana, yes.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Again, an excellent talk. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Right. Well, it's coming up to 7 o'clock. So unless anybody else has got any more questions, I'll bring this to a close. Rob, thank you very much indeed. That was an excellent talk. And as I said, we got the Battle of Austerlitz in a couple of weeks' time. So if you're interested in Napoleonic Wars, do tune into that. But again, Rob, thank you very much. And I wish you good night or good evening all. Many thanks. Take care.
Thank you, James. One and all, thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
James.
Bye-bye.